path in our study through the Old Testament. We are currently in the book of Psalms, and we'll be looking at the 22nd Psalm today. And if you've not had a chance to actually look through this really with much detail, I know a lot of times the way that it's approached is to look at a few of the verses that are found in it that are just so directly able to be seen as what happened with Jesus at the crucifixion and even at his trial and all that goes along with it. But it has a lot more passages or a lot more verses in it that really don't speak directly to what we might know about the life and the last basically week of Jesus's life. So it has led to speculation for a very, very long time, actually probably as long as the psalm has been read from the time of Jesus on, about who is being looked at directly. Now, obviously, there are some places in here that it is just too obvious that it's speaking about Jesus. And if for no other reason, the citations that are used in the New Testament about the passages here from the book of Psalms. But some people will look at this and say, well, it's speaking about things about Jesus, and yet who was the author? Now, most would not really dispute it's a Psalm of David, but when you start to look at David's life, as we see in most of the Psalms that he's written, he's writing from some kind of personal experience. And sometimes we would even know what the event might have been, but they all have a very similar kind of a feel to them when it's a time of distress and trouble that David was in. You can tell it's written from his perspective as the person who's going through it at the time. From what we know of the life of David, it doesn't really fit very well, the details that we see here in Psalm 22 of things that we know of his particular life. And there are some things clearly that never happened for as far as his life was concerned, and so we'll get to those in due course. Some of the other speculations, who it could have been, maybe Jeremiah, perhaps Hezekiah, some places that I've read where people have speculated that, and every single one of them falls short under examination. So to say it's from a particular writer speaking about themselves, nobody fits as far as this is concerned. And even if it was something that we could say it's written and it's only supposed to be speaking of Jesus in absolute, particular terms, there are a number of things that are said in this psalm that you think, well, from what we know about Jesus, it doesn't look like it would be something written specifically about him with the knowledge that it is him. Now, the one that seems to be of our options of how we can look at this that might make the most sense as I read it, because again, as a Bible teacher, I'm looking at this and thinking, how do you present this? Because you want to be careful with the text itself. If David is looking at this as a person that he may not know as the Messiah, but a person who is dependent upon the Lord and yet going through some horrible, horrific things, then this would be a righteous man going through something treated poorly or horribly by unrighteous people. So that part fits. So if we were to say David is the one who is the writer of this, and what he is seeing as God is showing him this is a man who is right before God, and that is proclaimed especially towards the end. But as David would see it, this person going through these things, maybe even not recognizing that he's the Messiah, would be able to give us, if you will, some description about not only what he went through, but the people that surrounded him. And there's a back, kind of it's as though it's the story being told of him, and yet there's so much, again, detail that we would look at and say, but was this really what Jesus actually went through, and would these things be said of him? So it's a pretty intriguing thing. It's a little hard to absolutely nail down with total certainty that not only just the writer, I don't believe there's much dispute that it was David, but what did he actually see? And when it comes to the matters of the Messiah, how thorough was his understanding of his subject matter here and the person of Jesus? So that's really the interesting question. But some of the descriptions that are given here are so vivid, and they're so descript that we look back in history and we say, who else could it be speaking of other than Jesus? And whoever this person is, as David would see it, answers many of these questions for himself, and he makes a number of statements. It's kind of written mostly from that perspective. So What I want to do is take a look at the citations here and the statements that are made, and then compare them to the things that we see in basically what was that last week of Jesus's life. And there are some other things. The people who contested with him and who hated him, we know that was something that was going on for the entirety of his earthly ministry. So when you think about the religious adversaries that he had in Jerusalem in particular, they were there with him the whole time. So whenever he would come to Jerusalem, it was always going to be something contentious. So Psalm 22, we'll just take care of this one today, and then we'll save 23 and the other ones that come after that for our next study together, because we didn't really want to race through this. And so Psalm 22, having turned there, let's have a word of prayer, and let's take a look at the text. Father, we thank you for the time that we can come before you and look at your word. Our desire is that we would grow in our understanding of you, and that at times like this, as we read this passage and this psalm, there are some things that we may not fully know, and we may not completely grasp the intent behind all of what's there. But what we do see is very, very telling, and it is something that we can look back and say what we view in the life of Jesus and what he went through was not something that wasn't foretold in ways. And so we pray, God, again, that we would be able to see your word, and that we would recognize the timelessness of it and how you will tell of things before they happen. So cause us, if you would, to be attentive to your word and to the work of your Spirit in our lives, and that we might grasp and understand the fullness of what you've written here and why it's so important that we understand these things. And we give to you all thanks and pray that you would guide us by your Spirit in Jesus' name. All right, so Psalm 22 begins with, this is written in Hebrew, and again, when we see what Jesus said at the cross, he was not speaking Hebrew according to the Gospels. It was kind of more Aramaic and a kind of a mixture of words that are recorded for us. And so the crying out and the exclamation is basically the same. So here, this shows it really doesn't fit David's life in any way that we know. Because David's forsaking, if it was just this verse here, God, my God, why have you forsaken me? There may have been times in David's life when he would have felt forsaken, but when you read the entirety of the psalm, it just doesn't fit his life. And there are those times of trouble, but there are things that we're seeing in whoever it is that's being written about that he never experienced. And so the only thing that I can take from this is, once again, this would be as though God is showing him a person that he would think, almost in the hypothetical sense, a person who's going through this, and he's kind of telling his story or letting this person tell the story through him. So in verse 22, my God, why have you forsaken me? Why are you far from me, from helping me, and from the words of my groaning? And so the crying out. And so we know that this is something that he said when he was on the cross. And of course, in the theological sense, the idea of Jesus being forsaken sounds completely foreign to us, that how could such a thing be? And again, perfect person, Jesus never once sinned. So the idea that God would somehow forsake him, and in the theological sense, we have to try to understand and to balance this, that here Jesus was going to die as a man for the sin of the world, but he was a sinless man. So when we read in 2 Corinthians 7, where it says, you know what, let's turn to it because I don't want to misquote it. But it is 2 Corinthians, actually I believe it's 5. It's that he who knew no sin became sin for us, that we might be the righteousness of God. So, it is 2 Corinthians chapter 5. And it says, in verse 17, this is something good for us to remember because it does help us in the context, but it's a great passage to keep in memory. Therefore, if anyone is in Christ, he then is a new creation in Christ. Oh, the former things have passed away. Behold, all things become new. And then it continues on as we get down towards the the bottom of the chapter at verse 20, it tells us that we are ambassadors for, or for the sake of, or in the person, for the person of Jesus Christ. As though God were pleading through us, we implore you on Christ's behalf, be reconciled to God. That was his whole reason for being here, which is what he says in verse 21. For he, that idea of reconciliation, for he, meaning God, made him, Jesus, who knew no sin, to be sin for us, that we might become the righteousness of God in him. So when the weight of man's sin fell upon him and he was judged on our behalf and died as a man, he cried out. There was that separation. And so Jesus cries out, why have you forsaken me? And so trying to wrap our minds around any type of separation that there could possibly be between Jesus and the Father, all that we can come away from this, we realize Jesus never stopped being eternally God. The only thing that changed in him was that he took on a body of flesh and blood for the time that he did. And that body of flesh and blood died on behalf of everyone who would ever put their trust in him. He died for the sin of mankind. It was such a foreign thing to him, and so he cries out. So that is the setting of this. The first verse tells us, and it quotes what Jesus actually said at the cross. My God, why have you forsaken me? And I don't believe he said it because it was written in Psalm 22. I believe Psalm 22 gave us an understanding of what he would go through and say at the cross. Of course, Jesus would have read this passage clearly, but he's not on the cross saying, I've got to check the boxes of Psalm 22 and make sure I say the things. He's too wrapped up in, he would have been clearly too wrapped up in the events of the time, but the agony that would have been there at the time of going through what he went through, it would have, of course, caused him to cry out, because he would have never experienced anything like this in his entirety of time here on earth. Obviously, wouldn't have ever, none of this would have ever come to pass before he left heaven and became one of us, and so left his place to become flesh and blood. So when he cries out, this kind of begins this narration, if you will, of what Jesus went through. And again, when you read some of the bits and pieces, you just go, as I look through what we have in the record of who he is and what he did in the Gospels, we need to be reminded of something as well. As we read through these things, and we're trying to find where is the precedent that we can see for why he would say this, or this would be the description that's given to us about him, we need to remember that in the Gospels, we just have snapshots from one day to another of incidents and things that took place. But imagine if you were going to give a detailed chronicling of the life of any person for 3.5 years. How many volumes of books would it take to give a description of the things that were said, the reactions to those things, the not only the things that are said, but the things that were also done, and what was the collateral, what was the fallout from it? So when Jesus would heal, what happened with the groups around, and what was being said and what was being discussed? All of those are really interesting questions, and trying to have an answer for them, we just genuinely don't. But what we have in the Gospels is just such a minute amount of detail of what took place in his life in those 3+ years of his earthly ministry. We just need to really kind of remember that we don't have all of the details. So reading something like Psalm 22, let's keep all of that in mind. Because again, there are some things where you look at this and you go, when did that happen? And when would that be the case? Because really the stuff that gets a lot of attention is what happened in the time when he was arrested, from his arrest to his mock trial, to the time before the Romans, and then being put to death. So that is what is primarily focused on here. And a parallel passage to this, though it's written differently. This is more written in the poetic sense, but when you read Isaiah 53, that's being written very much prophetically as well, but it's in a very prophetic series of passages. That whole section of Isaiah is really kind of dealing with this, but it is dealing with the crucifixion in every bit as much detail as this, and gives more together. If you take Psalm 22 and what you can take from it, of the most obvious things that clearly we have a picture of in the crucifixion, kind of all the detail that we get there, combine it with 53, and you've got a really, really good explanation of what took place, we know, from the Gospels. So don't want to get too bogged down in that. Now, he asks, why are you far from helping me and from the words of my groaning? Oh my God, I cry in the daytime, but you do not hear, and in the night season and am not silent. And so this is the idea of day and night, as though Jesus was really contending with this stuff for days and nights. It's just meaning in a continual sense. And so how long would this have been going on? These are those kind of verses that I say in here is like, yeah, but where did that take place? And where did we see that kind of agonizing, not hearing from God? And really, I don't see how it works other than what we saw in like the garden when he was praying, if there's a way for this cup to pass from me, nevertheless, not my will be done, but yours. There would be that kind of case where God doesn't answer that we have an answer to it as far as the Gospels are concerned. We have his question immediately followed by his willingness to go through with what he knows. Not as though God had said, no, you've got to go through it. It's almost a rhetorical where he says, if there's a way for this cup to pass from me, nevertheless. So it's not as though he says, is there a way for this cup to pass from me, and waits for an answer, and then one is not forthcoming. We don't have any of that detail. He just already has resigned himself to it. But again, the whole process, I guess you could say, from when he knew that this was going to take place, and remember from the time, clearly even before that, he was telling them before they ever went to Jerusalem what was awaiting him. And it's not as though God had turned his back from him at that time. Clearly, he was in fellowship with the Lord. He was in fellowship with the believers and the disciples, the apostles. The upper room things that he said, he clearly knew what was taking place. He was the one who said to Judas, go do what you must do. So he had resigned himself to those things. But as you read this, you just go, So is it not supposed to mean like this had been going on for days, but it's more in the way of a continual thing? Is the crying out but not having an answer. So it says, but you, this is why when Jesus would say, not my will be done but yours, there's a confidence that he has that everything, as difficult as it was going to be in the physical sense for him as a human being, nonetheless, he knew that this is what was necessary. He knew that the Father was with him. His whole reason for coming into this existence, as temporary as it was for this very reason. And he said exactly those same things. But nonetheless, when you're going through it and you're in the throes of what he went through and all of the barbarity of it, you can see that there's very much a human aspect to him. And that if it is as I believe that David is allowing, and he's writing out what he sees as though he's that person writing on behalf of the person that's being spoken of here, I believe Jesus, this is what it would have sounded like, I guess you can say. So verse 3, but you are holy, enthroned in the praises of Israel. Our fathers trusted in you. They trusted in you, and you delivered them. They cried to you and were delivered. They trusted in you, and they were not ashamed. So as it was for them, so also is it for Jesus. And again, this balance, we understand it in principle, but to understand the depths of it, because we don't even understand the full depths of what is it like to be eternally God, having no beginning and no ending, and then for Jesus to have laid that aside for a time, only to confine himself to a body of flesh and blood. How do those two things work? We know that they do. We know that he had to be perfect or he couldn't have been a sacrifice for us. And he had to be perfect because he was God in the flesh. That wasn't going to change anything. So he was the only one that we could ever say had a body of flesh and blood, a human body, but was sinless. It's never existed before. And so he is the only person who could ever make such a statement. Now, those things we can wrap our minds around. But whatever limitations there were in this physical body, there were still some things that he had total knowledge of that he shouldn't have otherwise had. Only God could have that kind of knowledge. And we just see the miraculous things. Nobody could do those kind of things. Only God is able to do those kinds of things. Calming the storms, raising the dead, healing the sick, casting out demons, doing the things that he did. there was never a time when he willed to do something that it took time or that it didn't happen, as he designed it and instantaneously. So there are fascinating things about that, again, that I don't know that our minds are fully able to grasp because we're trying to explain the eternal God with human reasoning and human understanding. So it is a challenge to us at times. Now, when we get to that point, once again, these verses 3, 4, and 5, he makes statements about this is who you have been to the nation from the beginning, to the children of Israel, but you've been this way from the beginning, really, with your creation. They've trusted, and you have shown yourself worthy of their trust, and so Jesus too. Even though he knows who he is, why he was there was still that dependency that he had on the Lord, and it comes through in so much of what he has to say, because he's always speaking, especially in John's Gospel. He's very good about capturing this. Jesus speaking about all the time that I do those things that are pleasing to him, that what I do because he has sent me here. I'm obedient to the calling that he has put upon me to do these things while I'm here. And so there was that constant fellowship that he had with the Father, and there's really no disputing of that. So, with all that being said, at verse 6 we get this. Now, again, hard for us to wrap our minds around, but it says, "But I am a worm and no man, a reproach of men and despised by the people." It's the second half of that sentence that makes the first half understandable. Jesus wouldn't have looked at himself as a, quote, worm. This is more of an indicting way of looking at the people who saw him as being somehow beneath him. And where do we get that from? Where do we get the evidence of that? And if I was just to say, point you to chapters 7 and 8 of John, those are great places to go. And look at the back and forth that he has with the Pharisees and with the religious leadership in Jerusalem. They had absolute contempt for him. Not only because of what he taught, but even the idea that you're from Galilee, you're from Nazareth, you're from that part, you're like the half-breed type people that, we were conquered by the Assyrians, you're those people, you've been infiltrated, we're the pure. And you get that, again, especially when you get into chapter 8, in the latter stages of that for sure, where Jesus says the things that he says and has to let them know who he is, that he's from above, they're from below. All of that interesting stuff. But if you were to stand him next to them, Jesus is a very unassuming figure from everything that we know. And yet here are the Pharisees. Here are the people of the law. We hear Jesus gives descriptions. They're in their robes. They're there for the accolades of men. They're adorned well. Jesus didn't have anything to do with that. He was a man who worked as a carpenter, but also was ministering to the people going from place to place. So that kind of just animus that there was, the hatred that the Jewish people had for him, the Jewish leadership, I should say, that they had for him is easy to see, especially when you read through the Gospels. So this idea that he's a worm, that would be not in his own assessment, certainly not in the Father's, but of man, and that's who's mentioned in the second part of it. A reproach of men and despised by the people, not all people. Because remember, here's a good thing, a great reminder for us. Of the people who followed him and believed in him, his audience was Jewish. So the people who believed in him when he was doing and saying the things that he was doing and saying, they were Jewish. That was his audience. So we're looking back at it from a couple thousand years ago, most of us Gentiles. And so we're able to look back and recognize that we would never look at Jesus in such a way. And of course, we don't despise him. We don't reproach him. We don't see him as a worm. We see him as the conquering Savior, the man who conquered sin and death on our behalf and is coming back as the ruling King of Kings and Lord of Lords. That's how I view him. But the people at the time, some of them viewed him much differently. They had absolute contempt and hatred for him, and the idea that he was put to death, as they thought, they had gained victory in that. But we would look at it and say, no, it was necessary. That had to take place. So as we go on, it says now, continuing with these people, all those who see me ridicule me, they shoot up their lip, they shake their head, saying, he trusted in the Lord, let him rescue him, and let him deliver him, since he delights in him. So this is the mockery that there was. Now, I want to go to where this is really kind of borne out pretty well as far as Matthew's gospel is concerned. So let's turn to the Gospel of Matthew. We're going to go to chapter 27. And really, if you want to capture a lot of what we're looking at in Psalm 22, Matthew does a pretty good job of covering a lot of the things that were said by the adversaries at that time. So in 27, let's start at verse 30. Let's look at verse 30. Verse 38. This is right after they put the plaque over his head. This is Jesus, the King of the Jews. Then two robbers were crucified with him, one on the right and then the other on the left. And you'll see that these guys are mentioned in Isaiah 53. That he made his grave with the wicked, and so that is alluding to, is the only way it looks, the two thieves that were on either side of him who mocked him. And then those who passed by blasphemed him, wagging their heads. And verse 38, when you read the other Gospels about this, of what the thieves said, they began in their mockery as well, and only one of them at some point realized that the mockery had to end, and he looks to Jesus and asks Jesus, will you remember me when you come into his king or to your kingdom? And that's the one to whom Jesus says, this day you'll be with me in paradise. But they both began as mockers along with the rest of the crowd. So we read this, verse 39, and those who passed by blasphemed him, wagging their heads and saying, you who destroy the temple and build it in 3 days, save yourself. If you are the Son of God, come down from the cross. Likewise, the chief priests and they were also mocking with the scribes and the elders, and they said, he saved others, himself he cannot save. If he is the King of Israel, then let him now come down from the cross, and we will believe him. And boy, what a taunt that would be, because it was completely within his capacity to do so. But it would have been a real problem for a number of different reasons. Two big ones primarily. If he comes down from the cross and doesn't taste death, we are dead in our sin and trespass. And in doing so, it would be a direct, flagrant disregard for what the Father had sent him to do. So it would be disobedient to the Father, and none of those things were going to happen. He endured what he did, even with all of the mockery and everything else, which Hebrews tells us that he endured the cross, despising the shame, and has sat down at the right hand of the Majesty. So as he goes through these things, there are these people who are mocking, and they're taunting him, saying, well, he's claiming to be this, and if he really is who he says he is, then he should get off that cross, which would just show that they had no concept of why he was actually doing what he was doing. So it says, again, verse 42, he saved others, himself he cannot save. If he is the King of Israel, then let him now come down from the cross, and then we will believe. He trusted in God, let him deliver him now, and if he will save him, and he said, because he said, I am the Son of God. So they turn their taunt now also. If he really is the Son of God, then let God himself come down and spare him at this time. Even the robbers who were crucified with him reviled him with the same thing. So there is that shooting up of the lip. It's the wagging of the head. It's the mockery. And you can read all of the descriptions that you get in the Gospels of this event. And I would I'd encourage you to do so. Go through and read the accounts of all of the Gospels at that point of what happened from the time that he was put up on the cross and the things that were said, and you get that, from the different perspectives, you get all of those little moving pieces, and it just makes a bigger, more thorough discussion and a treatment of the actual passage. So back to Psalms. But notice once again, this is something that you would say David didn't go through these things. So there were those who mocked, and that was clearly the case, but what's described there and how it would pertain if you were going to say, who best fits the description of what we just read in those verses? Jesus fits them better than anyone else. And you're going to find that is, if you've never really studied through this psalm, you're going to find that there are a number of those where you could say, well, this could be a description of the life of so-and-so, this person or that person, but there's no one that you could say, but it best fits Jesus, and there's really not a close second in this. And some of these other ones are coming up that are going to make that very obvious. So again, verse 8, he, speaking of Jesus, trusted in the Lord. Jesus trusted the Father. Let him then come rescue him. Exactly what was said by the Pharisees. Let him deliver him, since he delights in him. And Jesus would have said that. I always do those things that please the Father, and the Father, I in him, he in me. Those claiming the oneness and all the rest, they've been listening to him. And now as they see him on the cross, they're throwing it back as an accusation and as a mockery and as a ridicule and a reproach. So we get the picture here. Verse 9 rather. But you are he who took me out of the womb. You made me trust while I was on my mother's breast. I was cast upon you from birth, and from my mother's womb you have been my God. So be not far from me, for trouble is near, for there is none to help. Now this is a pretty interesting thing, because here once again, now the person that is being portrayed to us here through David's words, though I believe he's looking at someone and telling their story, if you will, because it's really not David speaking this way. It would be more, if we understand it properly, it's David recording what he is seeing and what would be being said by Jesus. This works the best. So the recognition that Jesus was from the womb, one dedicated to, cast upon, or given to the Lord, is not something that's difficult for us to grasp. We've already looked at one of the great examples of it, and it's found in the 2nd Psalm. So let's go there real quick, and we'll look at a couple of these examples, because I think that they're important. We ought to look at them. So it says, now, why do the heathen rage and the people plot a vain thing, in verse 1 of Psalm 2? The kings of the earth, they set themselves, and the rulers take counsel together against the Lord and his anointed, saying, let us break their bonds and their pieces, cast away their cords from us. But he who sits in the heavens shall laugh. The Lord shall hold them in derision. Then he shall speak to them in his wrath and distress them in his deep displeasure. Yet I have set my king on my holy hill of Zion. I will declare a decree. The Lord has said to me, you are my son. Today I have begotten you. Ask of me, and I will give to you the nations for your inheritance, and the ends of the earth for your possession. You shall break them with a rod of iron, and you shall dash them to pieces like a potter's vessel. That's speaking of God he takes it from the beginning to the end. This is the day that I begotten you, Father speaking to the Son, and this is the discussion that's between them, and he says, and it'll be so forever. The day will come when you'll make your enemies your footstools, and you'll crush them, and you'll rule them with a rod of iron. That's Revelation 19. That's kingdom kind of stuff. That's future to our time. So the idea that Jesus has always been seen as the Son, and yet there is a particular focus that is brought here of that time when he would take upon himself a body of flesh and blood, like John 1:14 talks about. The Word became flesh and dwelt among us. But it shows that the Word always had existed, verses 1 and 2. He has always existed, but he took upon himself a body of flesh and blood. And he came to pay for the sin of mankind on a cross, which is what we're looking at in context of Psalm 22. So with all of those things said, it says, be not far from me, for trouble is near, for there is none to help. Now he says, many bulls have surrounded me, strong bulls of Bashan, they have encircled me. They gape at me with their mouths like a raging and roaring lion. Now, where do you best find these examples? But before we go, I want to go back to this matter of the Son, because in case, when you read these things, if you're like me, you're trying to think, where do I find really good parallel passages to this? And I showed the one out of Psalm 2, and before we moved on, I didn't want to forget to do this. Let's take a look back to Matthew. Let's get to chapter 3. And let's look at verse 13. Now, this is early on in his ministry, and this is where John the Baptist recognizes him, but this is very early on in Matthew's account. So then Jesus came from Galilee, verse 13, to John at the Jordan to baptize him. So now he's made it down into the southern parts, and what you're looking at Jordan is really kind of to the east of Jerusalem. So he's come down from Galilee along the Jordan River to do what was just expected of Jewish people. The idea of more of a ceremonial thing of a baptism. It's an identification of the a male and his place within among the children of Israel. So it's not baptism like we're thinking, clearly, because we're baptized in Jesus. So it says, so John tried to prevent him, saying, I need to be baptized by you, and you are coming to me. But Jesus answered, and he said, permit it to be so, for thus it is fitting for us to fulfill all righteousness. And so he allowed him. Now, when he had been baptized, Jesus came up immediately from the water, and behold, the heavens opened to him, and he saw the Spirit of God descending like a dove and alighting upon him. And suddenly a voice came from heaven saying, this is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased. So that is the recognition that God is able to say, as I see him, my Son, whom I have sent, everything that he has done to this point is pleasing to me. What you have in Psalms is this person who is at this point at the cross. And he is saying, from the beginning, you have been the one, I've been put upon you, and so reliant upon, and you've been that one for me, the comforter and the one who gives me peace. And yet he's crying out at a time of despair. And again, we see that during the whole process of the crucifixion. Now let's look at one other place, and it's found in the 17th chapter of Matthew. So just pages down the road here. In Matthew chapter 17, we read this. This is, again, this is what we know as the Mount of Transfiguration. After 6 days, Jesus took Peter, James, and John, his brother, led them up onto a high mountain by themselves, and as he was teaching before them, his face shone like the sun, and his clothes became as white as the light. And behold, Moses and Elijah appeared to them, talking with them. And then Peter answered and said to them, Lord, it is good that we are here. If you wish, let me make 3 tabernacles, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah. And while he was still speaking, behold, a bright cloud overshadowed them, and suddenly a voice came from the cloud saying, this is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased. And he adds this part, hear him. Now, not just hear audibly, hear with understanding and become obedient and do what you're being called to do. And so very important that they would hear that, and that distinction from when they heard it in those early times. And at the time of his baptism, now it is hear what he's saying, because what he's about to give in the furtherance of the message is vitally important. We pick that up really as we look through John's gospel. Think about the things that they heard in the upper room. And it was all preparation, though they didn't fully grasp it at the time. Jesus is trying to say, you guys need to get ready for a world without me being right here in front of you. I'm going away. And it's a good thing that I do go away, because if I didn't, then the helper would not come. That was all said in the upper room. So whenever we read John 13 on through his arrest, whether it's actually in the upper room or on their way over or in Gethsemane, all of those things were said to prepare them for the inevitable. And that would be that he would go to the cross, and that in dying he would resurrect, but that he would ascend. He wasn't going to be among them any longer, but he would send the Holy Spirit to them. So all of that is in sight here. Now, verse 12 and 13, these people who had surrounded him, these strong bulls of Bashan, they've encircled me. And this strong bulls of Bashan is just a particular part down in the south this is where bulls and that kind of livestock were known to have been raised. And so if you read some commentators on this, they will just tell you, and it's kind of an observable thing, bulls are kind of weird. When there's something that's unusual to them, there's a fascination. They just kind of circle around like, what is going on here? But at the same time, they can be pretty volatile. And I think all of us know this. You don't want to get in front of a bull who's all worked up about anything. And so it's a good description of the frenzy it went from his triumphal entry of Hosanna, save now, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord, and all that happened on triumphal entry Sunday. But by the time that he's being put to trial, think of the barbarity that began to take place even at Caiaphas's place. They're hitting him, they're pulling out his beard, they're doing all of those horrible things to him. Then they send him off to the Romans, and there is that crucifying. We wouldn't have such a man to rule over us, and the just viciousness and the hatred of him. Think about when he was had the cross over him, and he's trying to carry it to the place of his crucifixion, and they're just lashing out at him, spitting, doing all kinds of vile things towards him, just out of their raw hatred. And again, I a little bit off subject, but as I kind of consider that, how often do we find that people would come before him with complete different ulterior motives, and when he would look at them, he knew what was going on, and he would basically answer them according to what was happening, going on in their lives, rather than what they were saying. So that there are people that he looked them in the eye, knew what was going on in their hearts and minds, and was willing to go and die for them anyway. And I think that many of those people who absolutely hated him, they had to have come around to an understanding of who he was. Paul was one of those people. We don't know whether he was in the crowd, but we know that he had a real hatred for Christianity and saw it as a usurping cult, basically. Turns out to be its biggest advocate that it's ever known as far as working among the church. As a mortal person, he had more effect than anybody that we know because of his writings and because of his travels. Just really an amazing thing. So with that being said, you see the craziness and the insanity of the mob that wanted him dead. Verse 14, I am poured out like water, and all my bones are out of joint. My heart is like wax, it is melted within me. My strength is dried up like a potsherd, and my tongue clings to my jaws. You have brought me to the dust of death. And here's why, because dogs have surrounded me, and the congregation of the wicked, they have encircled me. Let's think about what we know of what the crucifixion would have been, and what it would have looked like. Now, again, you have that because of Hollywood or because of artists' renditions, that Jesus was put on a cross with the other two guys, and they're somewhere up on a hill, kind of distant from everything. That really is more than likely, almost without question, not anywhere near what took place. Because this is something that you would want to instill fear and terror and dread and all the rest of it, and it was such a demeaning and an embarrassing thing to happen to the person who was crucified, and that's what it was intended to do. But it was so cruel and barbaric in the way that it would kill a person as well. So all of those things being at work, I do believe this. I believe that Jesus was crucified very close to the northern exit out of the city on what is known as the Damascus Road, and there's a very, very good candidate for what would have been the place of the skull as a natural rock formation to the north that actually has a first century garden still, that there's remnants of it that is there. They've actually done a lot of nice work with it, but there's a tomb that is cut out of the rock there, and there may be others, but there's one that's very prominent, and it's where we go when we're in Israel. But with all of that said, it would have been something that Jesus would have been crucified in a high traffic area where everyone could see him. If they're going to put a plaque above his head, you've got to be close enough to read it. So he'd be close to the ground. But if you understand, if you ever heard anybody give a description about it, and some people can give really vivid details if you really want to go through it, but the idea that they would have crucified him by putting a nail through the feet and a nail through, really probably not this part, because it would just rip out. More than likely it was here, because it would hit the bone that comprises the wrist, and it wouldn't allow it to slip. But more than likely they're bound as well with cords, rope, as far as the hands are concerned. But it would be excruciating to try to prop yourself up, because you'd be putting all that downward pressure on your feet, and they have a nail driven through them. Same thing, if you're trying to pull yourself up, what's going to be the worst. So the idea that a person would kind of slouch and hunch over, try to breathe, but do as little as they can to put any more pressure on the places where the nail holes are, ultimately what happens with a person at crucifixion, they suffocate. And so when Jesus cried out at that point where he says, I thirst, sounds a little bit like the description that's here, but it would be an incredibly agonizing kind of a thing as well. And the level of cruelty in this is absolutely mind-blowing. And to think that the Father sends the Son at a time when this was the kind of putting to death of people at the time at the hands of the Romans. Remember, if something that Jesus had done was blasphemy according to the law, it's stoning the way that it would be done for him. And in this case, no, this was done at the hands of the Romans. And what we're reading here is really not something that you would have seen at David's time being done in Israel. Some would say that there were cultures in other parts of the world that were doing this kind of thing. And the proof of it is, it's interesting, but it's not something that is traditionally understood as happening in Israel. It's just not what they would have done, not the way that it was done to Jesus, for sure. That was more of a Roman thing. So with all of this description, really interesting how they're talking about these people who have done this. And it says in the second part of verse 16, after it says the congregation of the wicked has encircled me, they pierced my hands and my feet. So the wording here in Hebrew is a little difficult for us to understand. It's put pierced here, but it also could just as easily mean that they have bound and pierced at the same time. There was a mutilation, if you will, of his hands and his feet. All of that is said, and again, there's a lot of discussion about the people who understand Hebrew, that there's even a question as to whether or not it was, in some of the translations, mistranslated, without getting into all of the details. But ultimately, the idea of calling it pierced or bound, and then that causing the kind of mutilation that happened to the hands and feet of this person, Jesus, that calling it pierced is a good example. Because again, we recognize, even from an Old Testament source, when you look at what Zechariah says, that the people of Israel will look upon Jesus whom they pierced, and they will mourn for him like they mourned for Josiah back at the time when Josiah was put to death, and at the area around what is Megiddo, up in the Jezreel Valley in the northern part of Israel. So with all of that said, the idea of his piercing, whether Old Testament or New, is really not a question. And especially we appreciate the aid that we get from Zechariah in that understanding. But it says, they pierced my hands and my feet. And some people could look at that and say, well, especially because of the language potential, maybe we're trying to read too much into it that it's Jesus. Well, look at what it says here. I can count all of my bones, and they look and they stare at me. They divide my garments among them, and for my clothing they cast lots. Now, when you get to that point, you just have to say, yeah, I think we're getting to the point where it's just too coincidental. Because again, look back at anybody that this could be looking at or speaking about. David doesn't fit. This didn't happen to him. Didn't happen to Jeremiah. Didn't happen to Hezekiah. Didn't happen to any of the rest of them. But from what we've seen, if we're looking at a movie or if we read it through the text, who else has gone through what we've just described in those main verses thus far? And this looks, and it's clearly speaking about what happened to Jesus, importantly, because what we're going to find is that this whole section, there are passages from Psalm 22 that are mentioned in the New Testament. And we're going to get to those here in just a moment. And so as we kind of work our way through the rest of these verses. So the first part, again, second part of verse 16, they pierced my hands and my feet. I can count all of my bones. They look and they stare at me. Now, what we would know of Jesus, once again, because he was always moving from place to place, made his trade as a carpenter, I can only imagine that he would have, at 30 years old, been a pretty genuine, decent specimen of a human. And so the idea that you would see rib cages and all the rest of it, we can't go by what we see in depictions today because we don't know. It's artist renditions. But we should be able to conclude that he was probably as fit as a person would be in those times. He was always moving from place to place, always active, always doing things. And he's a 30-something, 32, 33-year-old person at the time. So with all of that being said, the idea that he would be on the cross, and again, because you're kind of in a very vulnerable place, the idea that you could see all of his bones, or that the physical things you'd be able to see as he's kind of just put through the incredible rigors and the cruelty of what had taken place here. But the second part, this dividing of his garments among them, and for his clothing they cast lots. Let's go ahead and take a look at those things. Let's go to John chapter 19. John 19. And I know that you're probably all familiar with this anyway, because it's something that we've seen, kind of plenty of in movies and all the rest of it, and we've read the Gospels. But just understanding the idea of the people who would do these things to him, and the idea that they would take the things that belong to him and just kind of gamble for him to see who gets what they get. It seems like such a bizarre and an obscure thing to bring up in Psalms. But then when you see it actually done after the crucifixion at the hands of the Romans, then you start to say, there's got to be something to that Psalm 22 that was a way of helping us know that even the things that were happening and taking place at his crucifixion were done deliberately, or written for us deliberately in advance, so that when we see them taking place, we would say, yeah, none of this thing happened by random chance. We were given enough information in Psalm 22, certainly in Isaiah 52 and 53, to help us to realize that what happened to Jesus through no control of his own happened, and yet we were told with a lot of detail and a lot of vivid description long before the events. So we read in verse 20, let's go at verse 20. This is right after, again, the King of the Jews, and many of the Jews read this title, for the place where Jesus was crucified was near the city, and it was written in Hebrew, Greek, and in Latin. Therefore, the chief priests of the Jews said to Pilate, "Do not write King of the Jews," but he said, "I am." For he said, but he said, "I am the King of the Jews." And so Pilate answered, and he said, "What I have written, I have written." So the soldiers, when they had crucified Jesus, took his garments. They made 4 parts, for each soldier as a part, and also his tunic. Now the tunic was without seam, woven from the top with one piece. And so they said, therefore, among themselves, let us not tear it, but cast lots for it, to see whose it will be, that the scripture might be fulfilled. Now this is John's commentary. He quotes directly from Psalm 22. They divided my garments among them, and for my clothing they cast lots. Therefore the soldiers did these things. Now that's what we're about to read, or we just read in verse 15, or 19. 18. Verse 18 of Psalms is quoted directly after what John tells us. Here's his eyewitness account. What they did, they took the clothing from him, and they didn't want, they divided up, here, you can have this piece, you can have this piece, but the tunic itself is one piece. We're not going to tear it apart. Let's gamble for it. Whoever wins gets to take it with them. And then John says, and this was done that it might be fulfilled what was spoken. So once again, that's why I believe, for all the people that want to speculate, is this David talking about himself? Is the writer speaking about himself? Well, John says no. As David wrote those things, he's speaking prophetically about the person of Jesus, because this is a fulfillment of that passage. So that means that what happened here with Jesus makes it only about him and not about someone else. So, interesting. Back to Psalms. Verse 19 of Psalm 22 says this, but you, O Lord, do not be far from me. O my strength, hasten to help me. Deliver me from the sword, my precious life from the power of the dog. Save me from the lion's mouth and from the horns of the wild oxen. And so, once again, this is an interesting thing, because Jesus, the closest that we have to this is where he said, let this cup pass from me. But this is written, if we think of it in a chronological sense, he's already been on the cross, what we just read, and now he is saying, save me. Now, I don't think Jesus had any question as to whether or not God would save him. That's why this is, again, one of those places that it's hard for us to try to put all of these in their proper place, unless, of course, the writer of this psalm, David, more than likely, or almost certainly, when David writes this, he also maybe backtracks to really the kind of the heart and the mind of Jesus as he's looking at this. But Again, there's no time that it ever seemed as though Jesus ever spoke as any of these things being in doubt. We know that he trusted completely in the Father, but this doesn't imply doubt, but it implies something as though it's an unknown or an unrealized thing. So this idea of saving him from the sword and saving him, delivering him from the sword, verse 20, my precious life from the power of the dog, save me from the lion's mouth and from the horns of the wild oxen. So again, where does it fit and how does it fit? It's really a difficult thing unless we just say, if this cup can pass from me. It's the closest thing that we have to it. It says, now I will declare your name to my brethren. In the midst of the assembly, I will praise you. That is quoted directly in the book of Hebrews. So let's go ahead and look there at chapter 2, Hebrews chapter 2. Hebrews 2, the quotation, turn to the wrong book. So in verse, we'll start at verse 9. Now, clearly the subject of what is being written here, Jesus is the one he's the subject, he's the person that's being discussed here. But we see Jesus, verse 9, who was made a little lower than the angels for the suffering of death, crowned with glory and honor, that he, by the grace of God, might taste death for every one. Now, that is the line of discussion that the writer is saying here, speaking about Jesus, that he had to taste death for each one of us. Our minds immediately go to, yeah, that's what took place at the cross. Exactly. So that's the setup for it. That's the context for what we're about to read. For it was fitting for him, it was an appropriate thing for Jesus, for whom are all things, and by whom are all things, speaking about his creation, John 1:3, and in bringing many sons to glory, to make the captain of their salvation perfect through sufferings, or bring his ministry to completion, and he brings the rest of us with him. He's the perfect one who has gone before us, the captain, the originator, the person who leads, if you will, goes before the rest of those who come to him. For both he who sanctifies and those who are being sanctified, that would be all who believe in him, all of those are one. For which reason he is not ashamed to call them brethren, saying, I will declare your name to my brethren. In the midst of the assembly, I will sing praise to you. So here, the writer of Hebrews, if the question comes up, who are we talking about in Psalm 22? Is it about Jesus? Well, clearly, another example of it, of a quotation taken from Psalm 22, is attributed directly to the person of Jesus Christ. So there's nothing in this psalm that gives the impression that we're talking about multiple people. And it doesn't give the impression that David is kind of moving between speaking of himself and then speaking about somebody potentially other than himself. And even if that was the case, the New Testament settles who is being spoken of here, who is the object of this. If we read it as one narrative of one person, though there are some parts of it that don't really fully work, that we understand in our mind from things that we've been able to observe, we can at least put it out of our mind that it's speaking about anyone else, because the pieces of it that are too descriptive about Jesus, let alone the direct citation of not only John, but the writer of Hebrews, taking portions of this passage and applying them directly to Jesus, means they don't apply to anyone else. And that's one of the things I love about being able to study the Bible and say, let the Bible speak for itself. So it will, if you give it the time to do it and don't interject. So it says, for you, rather, who fear the Lord, praise him. All you descendants of Jacob, glorify him and fear him, all the offspring of Israel. Here's an interesting thing. If this is, as I believe that it is, Jesus who is the narrator in all this, it doesn't mean that it's now turned to David, having moved from that narrative. Now, some people might look at it that way. They might think at this point, now David takes back over in light of what we've just looked at, saying that these are the things that we should do. So the admonition in that line of thought comes rather from David. If this line of admonition comes from Jesus, then there's no break in any of the part of this psalm. And really, ultimately, all that they're being asked to do or told to do here is to recognize the God who has done these things. Now, why we would look at it in even a greater light than they could, we understand just who went and did the things that he did and what it ended up securing for those who trusted in him. He died for the sin of mankind, anyone who had ever existed before, who died in faith in God, and those who would ever die in faith going forward. He paid the price for the sin of all mankind. And anybody who would trust in God, as they knew that at the time, again, people under the law didn't know who Jesus was, but they died in faith according to what God had revealed to them. So, as with us, what's been revealed to us is everything that Jesus accomplished at the cross. We're not waiting for more details. We're not waiting for any more information. We have everything that we need. The only thing we await is him establishing his kingdom. So this admonition works perfectly no matter who is saying it. So people might want to wrestle with, well, is David speaking here now that he's told the narrative of Jesus and allowed him to speak for himself? Or is this still continuing to be the Lord who went through the things that he did? And I tend to favor that view. So here would be the admonition to us who read and to anyone who has ever read since. You who fear the Lord, praise him. Verse 23, and the descendants of Jacob glorify him, and fear him all the offspring of Israel. For he has not despised nor abhorred the affliction of the afflicted. And so, speaking of God, he doesn't despise as he looks at the people who are going through affliction. Rather, he's the one who comes to them. He doesn't pile on to them. Nor has he hidden his face from him, but when he cried to him, he heard. So this is one of those verses where there is that opening for saying, now David's taking back over the narrative, having told the story, because all the question becomes the him, or is it still Jesus speaking about himself in the third person? Really, again, this is what the scholars love to argue over. So it says, the poor shall eat and they will be satisfied. Those who seek him will praise him, and let your heart live forever. All the ends of the world shall remember, and they will turn to the Lord, and all the families of the nations shall worship before him. Now here's an interesting thing. The question would be, well, when did that take place? When did these things actually happen? And as we read these parts here about the nations and those who will come to him, we can say the first time that this would have been possible, from the time that this was written, the first time that there was really the bringing together of the nations that would come to the Lord, started with the church. Because for the first time with the church, this work of salvation went to Jew and to Gentile alike, and people from everywhere all around the world can come to know him. Where this will actually have its perfect fulfillment will be when Jesus comes back to set up his kingdom. Because the idea, and again, especially in the forever kingdom, when all corruption is gone, and the only people that will exist upon the earth will be those who have been redeemed by the blood of the Lamb. Everyone else who has ever rejected him or ever would is already put down. They are already in the lake of fire by this time. It's kind of hard to read, and it's hard for our hearts to understand, but every bit of rebellion has been put down, and everybody who ever rejected him is now in their eternal state of fire and torment in the lake of fire. Just horrible to consider. But when we will see this in its absolute perfection is when we're in the forever kingdom. Between when this was written and that eventuality, what we read at the end of the book of Revelation, there are still two other things. That time of the church, when really it could go to the nations, he could be the God of the nations through the church. And there will be that time during the millennial kingdom when the nations are gathered to him there at Jerusalem for those 1,000 years. And the kingdom is then brought here on earth. And then for that very short time of rebellion, Revelation chapter 20, you will find that time at the end of the millennial kingdom when he finally puts down the last of that rebellion. So with all that in mind, then we read through this. Verse 27, all the ends of the world shall remember, and they will turn to the Lord, and all the families of the nations shall worship before you. For the kingdom is the Lord's, and he rules over the nations. And boy, when I look at the ridiculousness of things in our current world, the way that they are, how I long for this day. I want so badly to see the Lord actually rule, because it seems like with every passing day, we're almost at the point of just being kind of numb to the just abject wickedness and the filthiness of man. And yet, here it says that day is coming. The kingdom is the Lord's. I love this. It is the Lord's to offer to whoever. He's always been the one who owns it. And there are people who look and they just say, well, if God is who he says that he is, why do these things go on? Not understanding that God says there's a time that he's going to allow man to have their reign, and the devil will be able to, infiltrate and do the things that he does, but that's not forever. The kingdom is going to be brought to earth. Verse 29. All the prosperous of the earth shall eat, and they will worship. All those who go down to the dust, they shall bow before him, even he who cannot keep himself alive. So the time when the living and the dead will stand before him, no one escapes from that. So if the kingdom is the Lord's, it's not as though people who say, well, I don't want anything to do with that kingdom. And I've heard that one before, the mockery of being separated from God, as they would say it, well, if I go to hell, me and my friends will have a party there. Yeah, well, I've heard that one, and it gets repeated by people who just don't even begin to understand what they are saying. And that's not how it's going to be anyway. But, nonetheless, that's just a way of trying to, put the discussion somewhere else. Verse 30, it says, now a posterity shall serve him, and it will be recounted of the Lord to the next generation. This is the coolest thing, is that it goes from generation to generation. There's a posterity. It's from one to the next. And as we think about it, it was also done in writing, not just verbally. It's done in writing too, because look at everything that was written from David's time. It's handed down through the generations, sometimes just from person to person, other times where God would task a particular person, write these things. And they're going to be preserved, and God is going to make sure that they're preserved in posterity to the people who would come after. Now, the immediate context, of course, would be David passing this on from person to person, and it would be seen as a much more of an Israel kind of a thing, we see in verse 37. So then they will come and they will declare his righteousness to a people who were to be born. They are not yet born. That he has done this. So this is going to be something reminding them from time to time. Now, again, if it's speaking about the person of Jesus, then what's being said here in verse 31 means that it's not just from the writing of a psalm up into Jesus' time, because Jesus and what he did is the subject of this psalm. So it's the recounting of what he did from this psalm and what we actually know that he did as the teaching through the Gospels, and then from the writers of the New Testament. And it is a posterity. It's handed down from generation to generation to those who were not even born. It will be a continual thing, and the story of what Jesus did at the cross and the importance of it to humanity will be in place through the generations until he returns, and until the earth as we know it and everything taking place here comes to an end. So really a fascinating psalm. Now, our next psalm is Psalm 23. It's the Lord is my shepherd, and there's really, I don't want to rush through it for sake of time. We'll just do it with a couple of other ones next week. There are a few other passages that we need to cover, and so with that, let's just plan on picking up at Psalm 23 next week, and we'll kind of work our way through those psalms the next time. Now, with the references that I may have given this time, if you have any questions about it, you can contact me through the ministry website, and that is through the email at oldpaththeology.net. And I'd love to be able to answer any email questions that you have about this or any of our studies. And we always love to hear from you. I made the announcement last week. If you're still following along with me, we have a trip that is scheduled for Israel next April, early April of 2024, if you're interested in going. And if you're going to get to the email, you can contact me and I can get the paperwork to you, showing you what the cost is and everything else. Actually, as of this moment, I'm still waiting on it. I should be getting it any day, and I would love to forward it on to you and love to have you along with us. So the Psalm 22 and the references, again, if you need any more on that, please contact me. But we will pick up at Psalm 23 next week.